Thank you all for joining me today as I discuss my dissertation study, Collaborative Professional Learning and Disciplinary Literacy, an approach for systems coherence during pedagogical change. The story you'll hear today isn't just about theories and data. It's about real people dedicated to advancing their practice with a focus on student learning. I'd like to thank them for being part of this work, the principals and the students at the study site for engaging in various ways, and above all, a thank you to the study participants for their courage to model adaptability and resilience for their students. You are everyday heroes. This presentation is organized around the 4 chapters of my dissertation. Any specialized terms will be defined as we progress. So let's begin. The study site was an American school in the Middle East with a diverse student body. In my role as Director of Learning, I was both a practitioner and researcher. The participants were members of the Grade 9 teaching team, 3 of whom had been present when we identified the study's problem of practice and began early cycles of action research in January 2019. Now, the problem of practice emerged primarily from 2 simultaneous pedagogical changes arising from the adoption of new standard sets in all subject areas, which shifted focus away from purely content to include communicative practice standards, or the ways one reads, writes, listens, speaks, observes, and understands the world like a professional in that discipline, as well as the introduction of standards-based grading in the high school, which is the practice of monitoring student progress against specific grade level standards rather than an aggregate composite score. Both of these disruptions were compounded by a new school-wide focus on global advocacy and a mandate from the principal to create interdisciplinary units. Note that, at the advent of my time there, I saw that disciplinary literacy had already been one of the teaching and learning priorities at the school for over 5 years, yet never implemented. So when the grade 9 teachers approached me about creating interdisciplinary units, I knew this was the opportunity to introduce disciplinary literacy as a way to unify all of these demands on teachers through a coherent systems approach addressing pedagogical theory, curriculum development and alignment, and instruction and assessment strategies. And no teacher can do all of this alone, and given their siloed existence, this became the problem of practice. Most people, when they hear the term literacy, only think of the ability to read and write, but this graphic shows that's a relatively narrow definition. Foundational literacy is the distinctive linguistic patterns and nuanced speech that contribute to a child's earliest literacy development. Basic literacy includes phonics, phonemic awareness, letter identification, vocabulary, etc., which prepare children for academic language, or the language of school, comprised of high-frequency academic words that determine their overall educational success. Now, the areas in the middle represent disciplinary literacy, or DL. I specifically chose Moji's 4 lenses of DL because she sees it as more than specialized words and communication styles. Through these 4 lenses, Moji believes that DL can help students link learning across various styles of inquiry and break down the, quote, natural consequences of the compartmentalization of subject areas that falsely results in the invidious distinction made among them in terms of values, priorities, and power. The cognitive literacy process lens is more commonly known as content area literacy because it provides generic literacy tools and strategies for accessing text that can be used in all content areas. However, as the structure of language becomes more advanced, students transit the juncture between academic language and generalized content area literacy into functional linguistics, which might include things such as Weinberg's thinking like a historian framework or Chen's think write heuristic for science. Teachers can also begin to integrate metacognitive process strategies such as visible thinking routines and question formulation to prepare students for a move into the ways of knowing and sense-making, known as disciplinary epistemologies, where they employ those functional linguistic strategies to craft knowledge claims and see the world through the lens of an expert. The cultural navigation lens of Moji's theory underscores the work of other prominent DL researchers, such as the Shanahans, who see each subject area as a, quote, unique culture of practice, with its own norms for how knowledge should be created, shared, and evaluated. Now, because no literacy is politically neutral, students empowered with an understanding of the language and epistemology of the established disciplines can engage in scholarly dialogue and critical consciousness. Now, you also see I've added a line connecting back to foundational literacy. For me, This might prove to be the most powerful equalizer for those who come from disenfranchised communities that don't have access to the language of power of those who create legislation that often ignores these communities. If students can move between the discourse of their neighborhoods and the discourse of the disciplines, I believe they can become true agents of change. Miskovic and Lutic assert that merely asking a research question reveals what we deem important and worth researching. The first question comes from my experience with the changes in the ways professional development is delivered in schools, moving from individual study concerning areas of personal interest to team-based learning focused on the school's strategic initiatives. Further, as current research by Eels, Hattie, and Donahue show, teachers' collective efficacy is the #1 determinant of student achievement. The second question comes from my experience as a curriculum developer, identifying which pedagogical approach may be the most efficacious way to deliver and assess these new communicative practice standards and the intimately linked shift to standards-based reporting. The following is a brief overview of the theoretical framework of the study and previous cycles of research, which informed the design of the innovation. Buttressing Moji's theory of disciplinary literacy are theories concerning adult learning. Although there are many ideas concerning the ways in which adults grow professionally and transform thinking, I chose Mesereau's transformative learning theory because it begins with a disorienting dilemma, exactly like the teachers experienced. He also believes people share their understandings and perspectives through collaborative learning in order to concurrently transform internal paradigms and build collective efficacy among teams. Asgen's theory of planned behavior complements Mesereau, and his survey templates served as the basis for one of the sub-constructs in my own survey concerning the individual's understanding of disciplinary literacy and their intention to integrate the strategies and practices. Concerning collective efficacy, Bandura argues that when teachers experience mastery, hear about others' experiences, and are excited to change based on social cohesion, they begin to transform practice and gain a collective sense of accomplishment, which continues to translate into a conjoint belief in their collective success. Early cycles of research prior to this study introduced students to the idea of DL by having them respond to provocations through the lens of a particular expert. During the first cycle in May 2019, students worked in discipline-specific affinity groups to respond to a video about a Chinese performance artist who makes bricks from particular matter he's vacuumed from the air. One group noticed that art and history talked more about why the man made the bricks, while science and math focused on how. Others noted that some groups sought a solution to the pollution problem, while others sought blame. One group noticed that artists and mathematicians both used geometry in their response. A second cycle in November 2019 with a different group of students centered on a similar exercise, except instead of the video, the affinity groups explored the neighborhood on a perspective walk. All of the students noticed the enormous amounts of trash. The artists saw the graffiti, the scientists worried about the impact on the environment, the English students again crafted stories about the people behind the trash, and the social scientists cited a cultural understanding of public spaces that differs from the West. From both the May and November exit surveys, students were curious as to why each group saw the same thing so differently, and they were upset about the damage to the global environment in both China and their own neighborhood. They wanted to act, but lacked what they called, quote, the right science talk that adults want to hear. As seen through Moji's 4 lenses, teachers realized they needed to be more intentional with specific instruction in epistemology, specialized vocabulary, and discursive methods of the disciplines in order to create effective and relevant interdisciplinary units. That realization led to this study's guiding research questions and innovation. Now, I strive to ensure that the study's methodology and innovation were congruent with the underlying theoretical framework. In order to respond to practice-embedded research and answer all elements of the research questions, I chose a multi-strand mixed methods action research design. This framework incorporated several distinct phases that informed the iterative, cyclical nature of action research, allowed for flexible collection and analysis of both qualitative and quantitative data, and explored new questions as data were connected. Now, early cycles of inquiry with the students and the teachers and a content analysis of the common communicative practices among the standards inform the design of the innovation, known as the Disciplinary Literacy Professional Development, or DLPD. The content analysis also informed the development of a tool used to help teachers analyze practice, which also served as one of the quantitative measures in the study, the Innovation Configuration Map, or IC map. Now, the process for creating the IC map was grounded in the content analysis of the reporting categories that the teachers devised in their vertical teams, the same gray box here from the previous slide. Although all of the subject areas framed their reporting categories around what students know, can do, and can tell us, the categories were not united across the disciplines. In order for the teachers to have common language concerning DL and see the ways in which their standards and reporting categories complemented each other, I used Moji's 4 lenses and the communicative practice standards to organize the reporting categories into 5 components, which ultimately comprised the framework for the IC map. These included conversing or talking like an expert, reading or understanding the language experts use, investigation, argumentation, and justification, or creating new knowledge like an expert, inquiring and questioning, exploring the world like an expert, and metacognition, or thinking like an expert. For each component, I then grounded the associated communicative practice standards from each discipline into a common crosswalk and noticed their subject-specific reporting category, so teachers could directly align their own assessment planning in the creation of interdisciplinary units. The final step was the creation of the IC map itself. I designed the IC map to help teachers assess their individual practice, guide their discussions around ways in which they could design the transdisciplinary student project, and help them identify future areas for interdisciplinary collaboration. Now, the IC map specifically addressed research question 2 while also providing insight into both the qualitative comments and the survey responses that informed research question 1. Now, similar to a rubric used by students to assess mastery of standards, IC maps identify an innovation's major components and describe various uses ranging from ideal implementation, those to the left of the solid line, to non-use on the right of the dotted lines, all along a continuum. Boxes were assigned a value of 5 for ideal to 1 for, well, not ideal. Teachers completed the IC map pre and post DLPD, the survey, the other quantitative tool. The design of the survey addressed both research questions through 3 sub-constructs for efficient data analysis: collective efficacy, collaborative professional learning, and disciplinary literacy. Questions were adopted or adapted with permission from existing professionally vetted surveys. All questions used an ordinal Likert scale with parallel responses ranging from strongly agree to strongly disagree on a 6-point scale, with 0 for don't know, unsure. Being a mixed methods design, the quantitative tools were complemented by qualitative methods. The bulk of the qualitative data came from transcripts of recordings made during the DLPD workshops. Teachers also communicated with me privately through messaging and email. Many volunteered artifacts from their practice, including lesson plans, assessments, and rubrics they had redesigned around the new communicative practice standards using DL strategies. My account of practice, while not a qualitative measure by definition, provided systematic and careful documentation of all procedures to provide a record for my ongoing contemplations, observations, and wonderings during the study. A series of workshops centered on the theory, strategies, and tools of disciplinary literacy, specifically functional linguistics and disciplinary epistemology, comprised the DLPD. I chose these specific lenses for 3 reasons. They're responsive to the students' feedback during the previous cycles of research concerning a desire to know more about the specific language and perspectives of the disciplines. They help teachers understand the new communicative practice standards recently adopted, and they reflect the reporting categories chosen in the shift to standards-based grading. Each session included reflections on professional writings about DL, as well as strategies for implementation. Teachers also collaborated on the design of a transdisciplinary project in each section. Now, to the data. Descriptive statistics are used to describe the basic features of the data and provide simple summaries about the sample and the measures. Data from the pre and post DLPD mean indicate teachers experienced aggregate growth in all three subconstructs, the most self-reported growth occurring in collective efficacy and disciplinary literacy. I also ran survey response frequencies for both pre-DLPD and post-DLPD surveys within each subconstruct and calculated the difference between the mean for each variable before and after the DLPD. I then ranked the results within each subconstruct from highest to lowest difference to indicate the variables most impactful on teacher growth within that subconstruct. There were 37 questions in the survey overall. Here, I've selected the high and low changes in the three subconstructs to demonstrate the range of responses and the ways in which participants perceived their change. For collective efficacy, 8 of the 9 variables saw positive growth. The highest growth was shown in student-centered teaching, with a focus on interdisciplinary thinking. According to conversations with participants, the one regression appears to be based on a deepened understanding of the epistemological differences among the subjects and a need for growth in this area. Or as my grandfather would have said, at the beginning they didn't know what they didn't know. Now at least they know what they don't know. For collaborative professional learning, 5 variables saw growth, with 3 moving an entire point. In conversations concerning professional learning at the school, teachers indicated that the disjointed and sometimes irrelevant topics, and even the cancellation of professional learning sessions altogether, reflected a more general impression of the school's approach to teacher development, rather than this study's professional learning workshops. In the subconstruct measuring disciplinary literacy, 6 of 8 variables saw growth, including a 2-point move in teachers' beliefs that their colleagues supported them in implementing DL in the classroom. Confusion still remained as to why the communicative practices were added in the first place. I compared all 3 subconstructs, pre-DLPD and post-DLP mean results against each other for 15 permutations. I chose a paired sample t-tests because it's a parametric test of interval data, the results of which produce a probability value, or p-value, that helps determine whether or not there is a statistically significant relationship between 2 variables. The results indicated a 95% chance that a positive correlation, or significant relationship, existed between teachers' feelings about collective efficacy and their knowledge of disciplinary literacy prior to the DLPD. An inference from this analysis could indicate that teachers were unsure of their own and/or their team members' understanding of DL's theory and practice at the start of the DLPD because 2 of the 5 grade 9 team members were new to the school, one of whom joined the team abruptly at the start of the innovation, replacing a long-standing and well-regarded art teacher who had been involved with the previous cycles. Additionally, these 2 members were brand new to the ideas of disciplinary literacy, while the remaining 3 still wrestled with some of the concepts despite participating in the previous cycles. The paired sample t-test also indicated a 98% chance that a significant relationship existed between teachers' feelings about collective efficacy and collaborative professional learning after the DLPD. An inference from this result could include that teachers felt positive about their collaboration on the student project and developed a sense of collective efficacy. Now, comparison of the IC maps pre and post DLPD indicated growth in all areas. Some teachers saw more growth in certain components than others. For example, the math teacher saw growth in reading and metacognition because she was able to identify texts and visible thinking strategies as a result of her understanding of Moji's 4 lenses, something she stated in her qualitative data. The English teacher indicated 4 points growth in inquiring and questioning because she came to understand that the content area teachers were addressing these through their subject area communicative standards. Therefore, she didn't need to teach generic research paper writing, but could focus on literary criticism and other ELA-specific ways of questioning. I'll talk more about the science and social studies in a moment and why the aggregate decline of 0.2 in investigation may actually indicate growth overall. The most aggregate growth was seen in 2 components of the IC map, inquiring and questioning and metacognition. These 2 areas directly correlate to the foci of the DLPD based on Moji's 4 lenses of DL, including functional linguistics and disciplinary epistemology. Now let's look a little closer at the science and social studies teachers. While the initial reaction may be Andrea, you really missed the mark with the science teacher. He's actually regressed. A deeper dive into the corresponding qualitative data indicated that the science teacher experienced a heightened understanding of DL specifically in conversing, reading, and investigating. After the DLPD, he was more intentional about integrating the communicative practice standards of the NGSS, or science standards, specifically in these areas. The data also indicate a clear transformation as seen by the social studies teacher, which was also supported by qualitative data, as evidenced by her growth in all areas. So let's look at this qualitative data that supports these findings. I began coding the qualitative data process by crafting an initial a priori coding framework with direct correlation to the subconstructs of the research questions, the same three we saw in the survey composition and which guided the theoretical framework of the study: collective efficacy, collaborative professional learning, and disciplinary literacy. The bulk of the qualitative data came from the workshops, which were recorded and transcribed using an online app. The first cycle, Elemental, was designed to explore participants' understanding of DL. I did 2 iterations of the elemental coding, the first based on the 3 subconstructs, and the second to add participant voice to their experience with DL and the collaborative planning process. The second round of coding was affective, to gain a deeper understanding of the participants' attitudes and beliefs about DL, which correlated with an underlying theoretical framework of the study, Mesereau's disorienting dilemma. To transition from the first cycle of elemental and affective codes to the second cycle of axial coding, I used a code charting approach to identify each participant's primary codes and determine emergent themes across the data. The 3 subconstructs of the survey aligned almost directly with the emergent qualitative themes. Collective efficacy was reflected most directly in a shared student-focused approach to learning. The strength of collaborative professional learning was shown through a desire to apply disciplinary literacy to communicative practice standards for assessing and collaboration. And their individual growth in understanding and applying disciplinary literacy aligned with the need to identify the, quote, lens and language within one's discipline. Analysis of the data corpus indicated that multiple survey variables, so each gray box represents an applicable survey question, align in all 3 areas and informed and supported the others. For example, aspects of collegiality and ownership presented across all 3 subconstructs, while participants' beliefs about the alignment of school goals corresponded with a belief in the availability of resources and creating environments that facilitate learning. And participants' intention to implement DL supported a belief that professional learning focused on the curriculum and how students learn in order to promote deep understandings of academic concepts and integrate knowledge and skills across subject areas. As for findings, for the first research question, based on the survey results and qualitative data, collaboratively learning about DL was appreciated by the participants because they were able to see each other's practice and work together designing interdisciplinary learning experiences. Therefore, there was and is a role for collaborative professional learning as an antecedent to collective efficacy. However, a deeper examination of the differences between collective efficacy and its antecedents, as defined by Bandura, and effective collaborative groups may suggest that teachers developed a sense of collegiality rather than true collective efficacy. For the second question, according to the IC MAP results and qualitative data, all teachers experienced some degree of growth in their understanding and practice of DL. The social studies teacher's transformation was evidenced by her IC MAP responses, personal reflections, and redesigned assessments and rubrics. She even included students in creating a rubric around the C3 standards and new reporting categories. Hers is the most pronounced example of the ways in which DL can equip teachers to address the dual dilemmas of the pedagogical changes. Simply put, after 3 decades teaching, she saw herself as an old dog learning new tricks. There were, of course, limitations to the study and lessons learned. One lesson learned was the need to integrate participants into the study design. Originally, the data collection tools included reflective journals and outside readings. Given the multitude of initiatives and teachers' other obligations, they felt there was no time for journaling. Therefore, the data collection shifted to transcripts and personal communications while maintaining methodological congruence. The shift to online learning due to the pandemic Well, it had an upside. It prompted teachers to make long discussed changes in learning and assessment practices to focus on authentic demonstration of learning. Some teachers began considering what had been called alternative assessments because they were frustrated with policing traditional paper and pencil tests. Others began considering which standards to prioritize, having discussions within their vertical teams about what the students really need to know for next year, which spilled over into their DLPD discussions about the ways in which the communicative practice standards, as compared in the crosswalk, could be reinforced across the subject areas. One major limiting factor in the study was the lack of coherence across initiatives, which caused teachers to feel overwhelmed and exhausted. Many were confused and frustrated, especially given that there was no direction concerning grading policies. Specifically, teachers wanted to know the ways in which the grading platform would calculate student progress and final grades. Although many of the teachers were redesigning assessments based on the new reporting categories and 4-point achievement scale, officially the grades remained a single-digit number that corresponded to an AF scale at calculated GPAs. Most frustrated was the math teacher, whose department colleagues expressed reluctance to shift practice before knowing how the software would calculate grades in the new system. She lamented to the grade level colleagues during a DLPD session that her department isn't using these new reporting categories, and we're not working to find different ways. Now, what conclusions can we draw from the data analysis, limitations, and lessons learned? The three themes that emerged from the combined quantitative and qualitative analysis underscore the importance of systems coherence in schools and support the idea of disciplinary literacy as a unifying pedagogical approach. From their discussions during the DLPD workshops and their experiences during 3 end-of-semester projects with the students, 2 in previous cycles of research and 1 for this study, teachers began to wonder aloud what concepts they could use as a framework for interdisciplinary collaborations, and even if the new reporting categories could be unified across all disciplines. Vertical teams, specifically social studies, began looking in more depth at ways to scaffold historical thinking skills and crosswalk with the other disciplines, math and economics, or the development of scientific advancements and methods within their historical contexts. Thinking back to the initial discussions in January 2019 that included the PE and world language teachers, they wondered about expanding the standards crosswalk to include these subject areas as well. Their discussions concerning the ways in which they could be more intentional in developing interdisciplinary units is underscored by Moji's words that teachers can, quote, create a meta-discursive pedagogy by developing courses of study that examine ideas from many different disciplinary and domain perspectives as a way of questioning the norms of their primary discipline of study. One way to do that is through a concept-based transdisciplinary approach. Now, we're familiar with the ways in which schooling is currently organized around specific siloed subject areas. There are also efforts to integrate the disciplines into interdisciplinary study. For example, an American Studies course in which ELA and history are combined. Transdisciplinary, however, is problem-driven learning that is beyond the disciplines. This particular example shows the integration of architecture, engineering, and psychology needed when designing buildings or campuses for various uses. Through concept-based transdisciplinary learning, students collaboratively construct meaning and address the collective provocation based on their understanding of the epistemologies and discursive methods of various disciplines, which mimics both the technical and soft skills needed in the workplace. Now, here's an example of a concept-based transdisciplinary unit or short course I designed for the 10th grade teachers. I was inspired by students' questions about current events, specifically systemic racism and the healthcare response to the coronavirus pandemic. And I remember the 9th grade students' comments about needing the right talk and understanding why different experts see the same phenomenon through disparate lenses. Based on the concept race, bioethics, and public health, I looked at the content standards and referenced news articles, podcasts, and even a museum exhibit that explored this concept. The various colors represent the connections between and among topics in different subject areas. For example, eugenics appears in both science and social studies. The story of African American Henrietta Lacks and her virtually immortal cells appears in both ELA and science. And genetics and biostatistics appear in both science and math. World languages and PE health can also be integrated into this concept. Through this framework, teachers can use the tools and strategies of disciplinary literacy to integrate the seemingly disconnected content standards into a cohesive exploration of social justice. Now, beyond the implications for practice, what implications for further study surfaced from this? We've seen that both the math teacher and social studies teachers were impacted by the vertical teams. Findings from the study are informative for developing complementary case studies that examine the scaling out impact of the DLPD workshops beyond the scope of the original participants. Now, despite a probability value of 98% between collective efficacy and collaborative professional learning after the DLPD, a definitive link between the two proved inconclusive within this particular study. Not all teachers experienced transformational growth, and as previous studies have found, self-efficacy impacts collective efficacy. I would suggest we build upon studies in other fields to explore the differences between collectively efficacious teaching teams and teams who simply collaborate well on short-term projects. In 2016, an 18-year-old girl named Mari drew President Obama's attention with her public letter concerning the deplorable quality of water in her hometown of Flint, Michigan. So I wonder, if Mari participated in a program grounded in DL and framed around concept-based transdisciplinary learning, might she choose a career in environmental science and public health to simultaneously navigate the cultural peculiarities of politicians and chemists concerning healthy water and the foundational language of her neighborhood? In essence, can DL truly empower students to critically intervene in social injustices and provide the language of critique and hope? Through this study, I aimed to understand how teachers engaged in collaborative inquiry and cycles of reflection concerning the adoption of new standards, coupled with a shift to standards-based grading and reporting, contributed to collective efficacy and individually transformed professional practice. As the teachers in this study stated several times, the lack of cohesion between and across all of their job expectations proved stressful as they navigated their daily work and revised current lessons in order to include the new standards. It was through their voices and courageous vulnerability that led me to a much deeper understanding of the important nuances between collective efficacy and collaborative teamwork, the processes by which collective efficacy is achieved, and the significance of systems coherence during paradigmatic pedagogical shifts. Secondly, a student-focused approach using Moji's four lenses allows for authentic curricula that examines relevant concepts through an integrated lens, encourages discourse across disciplines, and honors the cultural backgrounds of students while examining social justice issues. Disciplinary literacy has the potential to be a unifying approach for systems coherence when implementing standards-based learning through concept-based transdisciplinary units that purposefully and intentionally integrate and measure growth in the communicative practices of each discipline. Which brings us back to an image from the beginning of this presentation. Disciplinary literacy is inherently a pedagogical approach that enables and empowers students to engage in scholarly conversations within and across the disciplines. DL can help students discern information from various sources and contribute to a knowledge-based economy, which means they'll also be able to think critically about existing social issues and either self-advocate for change within their own lives or advocate on behalf of myriad causes. By also honoring their foundational language and providing representation of all students in our classrooms and connecting it back to the cultural navigation lens of DL, we can cultivate and inspire our students to become brokers of understanding across real and perceived boundaries because of their ability to build communicative bridges of empathy and social justice among numerous communities. These are global advocates. These are the folks who can see the interconnectedness of our world. These are the bright lights we need as we bravely climb the hill. Now, I'd like to close by expressing my deep and sincere gratitude to my friends and family for spending time with me today. Thank you to the faculty and staff and the Mary Lou Fulton College of Education Ed.D. program for their dedication to meeting the needs of practitioners and encouraging action research that truly impacts our communities. Thank you also to my colleagues in the Ed.D. cohorts, both the original and present, and my learner-scholar community for their constant support and levity. And special thanks to my committee. Dr. Quate for being there at the birth of this study's problem of practice and holding up the proverbial mirror when I needed it. Dr. Wolf for helping me understand qualitative methods and crafting your courses so that they empower us as learners, hear our voice, and model authentic learning. And Dr. Sampson, my chair, for your guidance and tough love on this journey. You've both scared and humbled me in all the most productive and meaningful ways. And for that, I am most grateful.